But first on BBC One, it's Sunday the 17th of January 2021.
Hello. Today, tomorrow, and for the next few weeks, the National Health Service is going through its greatest test since it was formed in 1948. Although we talk about the NHS as an institution, it really isn't about that. It's about the exhausted, well-trained men and women giving their all this morning and every other morning, taking personal risks to care for the very sick and to get those vaccines into us. It's about people of all ages going in again and again, bone-tired, when their bodies say, turn over, go back to sleep, and then working for many hours, stressed, hot, and sometimes grieving. We were right to clap for them, but this winter, clapping doesn't seem quite enough. I'm joined this morning by the head of the NHS in England, its Chief Executive, Sir Simon Stevens, to talk about vaccines and also about the end of the President Trump era, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Rabb. In the latest of our leader interviews, I'll be joined by Sir Ed Davey of the Liberal Democrats. And as Washington braces for what could be a difficult inauguration of President Biden on Wednesday, I've been speaking to CNN's experienced commentator Gloria Borgia. To review the news, our very own experienced and, dare I say, veteran health editor Hugh Pym and Lucy Fisher, the brand new deputy political editor of the Daily Telegraph. But first, the news with Nina Warhurst.
Andrew, good morning. 10 new mass COVID vaccination centres are to open in England this week, joining 7 regional hubs already in operation. The government's hoping to vaccinate 15 million people across the UK by the middle of February. Yesterday, 324,000 vaccine doses were administered, taking the total across the country to 3.5 million. The government's offering help to airports which will be badly hit by the suspension of travel corridors. Ministers say a scheme announced in November will start running in the next 2 weeks, offering up to £8 million to cover fixed costs such as business rates. Cornwall's been chosen to host the leaders of some of the world's biggest economies for the G7 summit in June. The seaside town of Carbis Bay will be the venue for discussions on debt, climate change and post-COVID recovery. Incoming US President Joe Biden's expected to attend the event, along with leaders from Canada, Japan and the EU. Large parts of the US are on alert for possible violent protests ahead of President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration on Wednesday. Much of Washington, D.C. will be locked down, with National Guard troops deploying in their thousands. President-elect Joe Biden's team has unveiled details of what the next president plans to do during his first few hours in office, including the reversal of some of Donald Trump's key policies. And 10 climbers from Nepal have completed one of the last remaining challenges in mountaineering, reaching the summit of the world's second highest peak, K2, in winter. It's the last of the 14 tallest mountains to have been conquered during the winter months. K2, which is only 200 metres shorter than Everest, is widely considered the most demanding of all in winter. And that's it from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back with you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. And so, as ever, to the papers. And the Sunday Telegraph has a great cheering, if true, headline. All over 18s, it says. All adults could have the jab by the end of June. We'll be talking about that later on in the programme. And they've also got an interesting story there suggesting that Joe Biden is going to come to the UK before any other non-American country. I'll ask the Foreign Secretary about that later on as well. There's the Sunday Times. That's the story you heard on the news. All arrivals, it says, in the UK will face hotel quarantine. That's the same kind of process that Australia and other countries have used in the past. The Observer has a story about staff being ordered back to work in breach of COVID rules, it says. Very interesting story there. The Mail on Sunday has been pursuing the origins of this epidemic for a long time in story after story after story. It makes the front page today, 287 days after the Mail on Sunday first spotlighted the Wuhan virus lab. That's where it says the virus escaped from. The American staff say the staff fell ill there weeks before the world knew about COVID. America points the finger at China lab. And the Observer I've talked about already, silly me. Well, to review the papers, before I get on to the rest of the papers, outside London, I should say, a couple of important paper front page headlines, because we've been talking about this as a London story, the hospitals story, but it's not. There's the Manchester Evening Post, hospitals reaching crisis point, it says. And up in Scotland, the outcome of the Brexit trade negotiation is causing a lot of anger, particularly among fishermen. Scotland on Sunday, sinking under the weight of red tape. That's the Scottish fishing fleet. So lots to talk about. I've got the health editor, Hugh Pym, and Lucy Fisher from The Telegraph waiting there as well. Hugh, let's start with you. And upbeat messages on the front pages this morning, or at least a couple of them.
Well, that's right, Andrew. First of all, the Sunday Express, a piece written by Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary for England. We can see the way out. We're nearly in the home straight. This is all to do with rollout of the vaccines programme. He's urging people to do their bit, helping any over 80s they know to get to their vaccinations, give them a lift to the GP hub or the vaccination centre or whatever. Then in the Sunday Telegraph, this pretty upbeat headline, all over 18s could have a jab by the end of June. Lots of very positive messages coming from Whitehall sources. Though if you look at what Sir Simon Stevens has said in a select committee just a few days ago, he was very careful with the programme that he set out. As we all know, the plan is to get 15 million people with at least their first dose by the middle of February, the most vulnerable 4 groups. Then if you look at all the priority groups, the over 50s, it's late April, and actually it'll be the autumn, realistically, by the time all adults get their jab.
It's that word could, isn't it, you? Readers of headlines have to be very careful about the words. I could win a national beauty contest. It's just that it's not very likely. Could and would are very different words.
Indeed, and preparing expectations, I think, in terms of what can and will be delivered.
Lucy, let's turn to you. We've been talking about your story, but let's turn to the Sunday Times. You've chosen the front page there, which is about quarantining all arrivals and putting them in hotels. What's different about the proposal here as to where we are now already?
Well, we heard from the Prime Minister on Friday that there will be major changes to the border as of 4 a.m. tomorrow. From that point onwards, all travel corridors will be scrapped and all inbound passengers forced to produce a negative COVID test and to quarantine for 10 days once arriving. This new batch of proposals that the Sunday Times reports on today represents a much stricter series of measures. This would involve the creation of quarantine hotels, which would force inbound passengers to stay there and to pay for them. And they're not cheap. We've seen that in Australia, which already has a similar system, that passengers are forced to pay between £1,500 and £2,500 to stay in these hotels.
So this is something that has worked abroad, but it's not been done here, and it has been effective in the past. I think Number 10 are apparently saying that they haven't taken this decision yet. We'll talk to the Foreign Secretary later on about whether it's going to happen or not. But it's the accusation has been made again and again and again that this government is not quite tough enough, early enough, to have the effect that other countries have had.
Yes, there have been plenty of questions in the past days about why the government didn't rush to act sooner when we saw the likes of New Zealand take these measures of what they call directed isolation that seem to have a large part of success early in the pandemic in stopping the spread. But I think the reason that these measures are being considered now really reflects ministers' concerns about some of the new variants we're seeing around the world of coronavirus, particularly some of the variants coming out of Brazil, amid the concerns that they could be vaccine busting.
We were talking just a moment ago about that very cheering story in the Sunday Telegraph suggesting that all adults could have the vaccine dose by June. And now none of us know what's going to happen in the future. We're not stargazers. But do you think that is feasible? Could it be done?
Well, certainly, we've seen 3.2 million members of the UK population vaccinated so far. That's 40% of over 80s, 45% of over 80s, 40% of care home residents. They do seem to be making good progress on the vaccinations. And very interesting to see in the Sunday Times talk of the Cabinet agreeing a 3-point plan to start lifting some restrictions from the end of March. So I think you could actually see the quite interesting scenario in which some parts of the economy and society see rules and regulations eased within the UK, but in fact the borders remain closed for a lot longer in effect because of concerns about the new variants.
Very interesting prospect. Hugh, can I turn to you for another story in the Sunday Times, which is really about what's happening in London hospitals? We know that they are in a very, very parlous and dangerous state at the moment.
Yes, this is the other side of the story, isn't it? A lot of optimism about vaccinations, but the reality now for the NHS, critical care units and major hospitals is extreme pressure, and it's a very, very difficult situation. And the peak for hospital admissions, we heard from Professor Chris Whitty on Friday, could be still a week or 10 days ago, certainly outside London. And from tomorrow, the Sunday Times story here, hospitals on surge alert around the country to transfer patients out of London to the Midlands, to hospitals there to take the pressure off. But the pressure's growing anyway around the UK, beyond London and the southeast, where we first saw the heaviest pressure. So I think it's going to be an extremely difficult time for hospitals in the NHS for a little while longer.
Do you think people will be ferried around the country looking for spare beds?
Well, I think that they will have to identify the beds outside London and then move them, but that will certainly take some transport, specialist ambulances, and also a doctor and an intensive care nurse to travel with the patient. So it's moving staff away from the hospital.
Is it? Yeah.
Exactly. It'll be a very difficult and complex situation.
Lucy, let's turn to another aspect of this, which is the plight of people who are on the lowest incomes getting universal credit. There's a big vote, two big votes coming in the House of Commons this coming week. One of them is about whether the £20 extension is going to carry on. Can you just explain the politics of that for us?
Well, last year we saw an uplift in the universal credit payment worth £20 a week. That is now due to come to an end in April, sparking a lot of concern about a cliff edge for families, 6.2 million families on universal credit payments, losing out on that in pretty difficult times as the country faces a double-dip recession. What we see today in The Observer is very interesting analysis from the Bright Blue liberal conservative think tank, showing that actually if the Conservative government doesn't agree to roll over this uplift and extend it, then in fact it will be those families in the red wall seats that are hit hardest. And of course, those are the seats across the North and Midlands that form the bedrock of the stunning majority that Boris Johnson won back in December 2019. So he faces a very difficult decision here about whether to, continue this payment, which is a huge cost to the Treasury, or to come up with some other solution to avoid a potential revolt among Red Wall MPs. So
a shrewdly chosen Labour amendment there. Can I ask about the other vote? Ian Duncan-Smith, former leader of the Conservative Party, has a very, very passionate piece in the Sun newspaper about the plight of the Uyghurs in China. Now, that is going to, again, come onto the floor of the House of Commons. And I'm sorry, again, explain.
Well, on Tuesday, we're going to see the trade bill come back to the Commons. Already, an amendment passed in the House of Lords aims to give English courts the opportunity to review evidence on potential genocide and make a determination if an overseas state has indeed conducted genocide. It's Ian Duncan-Smith, one of the leading China hawks, very well informed about everything that goes on in China. It's his contention that the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs does amount to genocide, and he wants to see the courts handed that power. It comes after Dominic Rabb in the past week has made a very hard-hitting statement calling out China on human rights abuses, saying that their treatment of this persecuted Muslim minority amounts to torture. But so far, my understanding is the Foreign Office and the wider government is very wary of giving into this amendment. So mounting momentum for a Conservative revolt on that front too.
Very interested to see what Dominic Rabb says later on. Lucy Fisher, thanks very much indeed. Hugh, just before we leave you, we'll be talking to Simon Stevens in a moment. He is under some political pressure, do you think?
Yes, I mean, he's got a huge task on his hands, rolling out the vaccination programme, the biggest thing in the history of the NHS in terms of mass immunisation. He's under pressure. The government's obviously under pressure as well over it. What can be delivered? And, of course, the Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland governments as well. This is the biggest and most important thing ahead, and it's going to be very, very, very interesting to see how it all develops.
Hugh Pym, Lucy Fisher, thanks both very much. Very interesting review. And so to the weather. Beautiful snow scenes across much of the country this week. Cold, rain, freezing mud all round me. We can't get out much anyway, but perhaps next week will be a little more inviting. Over to Louise Lear in the weather studio. Louise.
Don't know what you're talking about, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. Look at this. Beautiful. Beautiful out there for today, but there's more wet weather to come in the forecast, I'm afraid. But absolutely glorious in North Yorkshire this morning and not as cold as it has been. Now, we have got some showers closest to this low pressure, and actually this weather front will enhance the rain across the northwest of Scotland for the remainder of the day. This is where we've seen the showers so far this morning. Still a little wintry to the tops of the mountains, but at least these showers have eased away from the southeast. And for most of us, it's a dry, settled Sunday in prospect. Yes, it's on the breezy side, particularly across exposed west-facing coast. Gale force gusts of winds likely in the far northwest of Scotland in excess of 40 miles an hour. Outbreaks of showery rain here, but in the sunshine we'll see temperatures peaking between 6 and 9 Celsius. That's average for this time of year. Then as we look ahead, looks likely that we're going to see some heavy rain to come through Tuesday into Wednesday, and that could bring the risk of some flooding. So low pressure tends to dominate. It moves its way across England and Wales during Tuesday and Wednesday, and then will shift further north. Brings with it a southwesterly wind. So for England and Wales, noticeably milder through Tuesday and Wednesday, but that mild air never likely to make it to the far north. Back to you, Andrew.
Louise, many thanks for that indeed. Now then, stories this morning that the new President Joe Biden's going to make an early visit to the UK ahead of the G7 meeting of world leaders in Cornwall in June. To talk about that and the obvious coronavirus news, I'm joined now by the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Rabb. Mr Rabb, welcome and thanks for joining us. Can we get every adult in this country vaccinated by June?
Well, the plan, as you know, is, and we're making good progress. We've had 3.5 million people administer their first dose. The daily rate is up to over 300,000 on the latest figures. And the plan is to get the first 15 million most vulnerable people vaccinated with the first dose by the middle of February. We then want to get by early spring another 17 million. At that point, we'll have 99% of those most at risk of dying of coronavirus administered their first jab. And then the adult population, entire adult population, we want to have been offered a first jab by September. That's the roadmap.
So the answer is no, basically. It won't be done by June, it'll be done by September.
Well, what I was just going to say is that's the roadmap. We think we've got the capacity to deliver it. Obviously, if it can be done more swiftly than that, then that's a bonus. The number one thing right now is to protect that roadmap and that rollout and protect the NHS, given the new variants and the transmission rates we've seen.
And is any delay about capacity? Is it true that AstraZeneca and Pfizer have delayed some deliveries of vaccine?
Look, there's all sorts of challenges with the rollout, distribution, logistical. We've got 365 million doses, seven suppliers. You rightly mentioned Pfizer, AstraZeneca, now Moderna rolled out. We're confident that we've got the flexibility, the latitude, but it is an enormous challenge, and we're meeting it. We've got the numbers already administered that I've mentioned, but we take nothing for granted, both in terms of the DHSC, also the MOD, the defence, the military supporting it. So but there is a boxing and coxing to make sure we can keep that capacity, those numbers of doses being rolled out.
And just on capacity, have AstraZeneca and Pfizer had to delay some deliveries? I'm not aware that there's been a delay beyond the flexibility that's built into the rollout programme. Obviously, there's an element of flexibility that has to be built into all of this. But you can see from the numbers and the latest daily figures, 320,000 per day, that we are getting the rollout going very effectively. If you look internationally or take Europe, we have double the number of doses for the next leading country in Europe, which is Denmark. So we're making good progress, but you're right, we've got to scrutinise, keep an eye on all those different aspects of the rollout. There's talk about a fourth vaccine called Valneva, a French vaccine which is being manufactured in the UK and of which the British government has asked for 60 million doses. And that might come as early as next week. Have you heard about that?
Look, we keep all of the vaccines that are in the pipeline, if you like, under review. We've got, as I said, 7 different suppliers. I'll allow the Health Secretary and DHSC to announce when they've got news on the further different suppliers that will come on tap. That is all part of the plan that I described.
Well, that is all good news in a way. Do you think that we should be vaccinating night and day, round the clock now to get this done?
We need to be doing it at the maximum that's deliverable. So in terms of the 24/7 idea, that's something that will be piloted. Of course, you've got to get people to the centres that we've got, as well as setting them up. So that's something that we'd need to test. I think, again, on the positive front, we've got a situation where by the end of January, we'll have over 1,000 local sites, over 200 hospital sites for vaccination, and a whole range of these mass vaccination sites, which are being rolled out at greater scale next week.
A lot of your backbenchers are saying, well, if we get the most vulnerable groups all vaccinated on target by the middle of February, that means 3 weeks later, early March, we can start to reduce the systems and the tiers and so forth and get some of the restrictions gone. Is that the kind of system that you can accept? Sorry.
So the aim is by the middle of February to have 88% of those most at risk of dying of coronavirus with their first jab, and by the early spring to have 99%. So that's the milestones, if you like. I think it's true to say that when we get to a situation in the early spring, perhaps March, if we've succeeded in hitting those targets, and we've made good progress so far, we can start to think about the phased transition out of the national lockdown. I think it's fair to say it won't be a big bang, if you like. It will be done phased, possibly back through the tiered approach that we had before. But the number one thing we want everyone to focus on now is, first of all, protecting the vaccine rollout. Secondly, the NHS is under huge pressure. Follow the guidance. Everyone watching the show should follow the guidance, stay at home, with the exception of the limited exceptions that have been set out, so that we protect the NHS through what is still going to be a very difficult series of weeks.
But if we follow those rules, possibly restrictions beginning to be lifted in March.
Well, we've said by spring, by early spring. So we've got the roadmap. I've set it out quite clearly, the targets, the milestones. I don't want to get ahead of that. What we're going to focus on now is delivering.
Is the biggest problem ahead the new variants?
I think the challenge with the new variants, and that's why we've taken a precautionary approach on the travel corridors, is we've got to get the genomic sequencing and the analysis done to see whether they, A, are more fatal in terms of their impact on people that suffer coronavirus. Secondly, do they undermine the vaccines that we've got in place? We don't have the evidence to suggest that so far, but what we don't want to do is find ourselves in 2 or 3 weeks' time whereby our vaccine rollout, for example, is imperiled because we haven't taken the measures, the precautionary measures that we have taken now on travel corridors. So again, as I said, the two strategic aims now are protect the NHS and protect the rollout of the vaccine.
And to do that, are you going to require people coming into this country to self-isolate in hotels before they join the rest of the population?
Well, we've said we'd keep all the potential measures under review.
I'm sorry to jump in, but why keep it under review? You know this works in other countries. You know it's been highly effective in other countries. And there is a perpetual suspicion that you're acting slightly too late again and again. Shouldn't you be ahead of the curve and announcing this now?
So first of all, I think there is a challenge in its workability, its deliverability, but we need to look at that very carefully. You're right, based on the experience of other countries. I don't accept that we've been too slow in this. We're broadly the same pace in terms of Canada and Germany. The system that we're now putting in place is, as well as the negative test you have to get on a flight to come to the UK 72 hours, within 72 hours of your departure time, we are making sure that people fill out the passenger vacation form. We've got extra checks to make sure that as people come into this country with the travel corridors suspended, they go into the 10-day self-isolation. There'll be checks at home, there'll be checks at the border. And I think that is the most effective measure that we could take at this point in time. But as I said, obviously we'll keep other potential measures under review, but they've got to be workable.
Just a couple of days ago, Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, that said that quarantine was the most important tool in all of this. But the ONS, the government's own organisation, has shown that 29% of people coming into the country who knew that they should be quarantining didn't. So it's not working, is it?
Well, I think it's the most effective measure if done correctly with the other measures, the pre-departure negative test. And as you rightly say, there's an issue about its enforcement, which is why both at the border force are going to be increasing the checks that are done, but also Public Health England are going to increase the checks that people are actually quarantining in their homes. So I think it's a fair challenge, and we're ramping that up to make it more effective.
But if nearly a third of people are not observing quarantining and you're not putting putting in new measures to ensure that they do. It just requires one person to come into the country and start to spread a new variant around. I put it to you again that these measures aren't going to be effective enough.
No, Andrew, sorry, in fairness, you're not taking into account what I've just told you, which is that we are precisely increasing the enforcement checks at the border through the border force, but also through PHE, Public Health England, for people in their homes. There are fines for not adhering to these rules. What's most important is that we've got a proportionate but an effective system of checks, and that is part of what we're doing this week.
The Immigration Service Union says that those checks are very basic.
Well, no, they're to check people are in the home as they should be. If there's any doubt about that, there'll be follow-up. And if people are flouting the rules, there'll be fines. That's crystal clear.
Let's turn to universal credit. Do you think the £20 of extra should carry on for months or years ahead?
Well, we introduced that measure as a government that introduced that to make sure that we could look after the most vulnerable, and it was always a temporary measure. So we will always look at everything in the round to make sure we can support the most vulnerable coming through this crisis. And obviously in March, there'll be a budget where, again, that holistic approach can be taken by the Chancellor. But we've put that support in place to make sure that the most vulnerable communities can be protected at this very difficult time.
And many of those most vulnerable communities are, of course, in red wall seats. A lot of your colleagues are persuaded of the case for keeping that payment going. Are you going to order them to abstain on the vote tomorrow?
Well, we will suggest that abstaining on what's effectively Andrew, let me answer. What is effectively a political debate, there is obviously the opportunity. We introduced this measure because we accepted the case for additional support for the most vulnerable during the pandemic. Of course, we've got a March budget well before the end of the temporary uplift in UC, which is a chance to look at this in the round. And if you look at what the Chancellor has done right the way through the pandemic, from businesses, small businesses, to the most disadvantaged, he's made sure that we've got as strong economic but also social measures as possible to shield those who are most at risk.
We are talking about tens of thousands of our fellow citizens for whom £20 a week is the difference between making things work and failure. They are desperate to know whether that money is going to carry on. Why make them wait?
We all said this would be a temporary measure. I think it's right to look at this in the round. You have a March budget coming up. And frankly, the debates, and look, I think it's right to have scrutiny right the way through, but this is a political debate rather than the government's measures, which can, I think, be looked at in the round rather than dripped out one by one just because there's a debate that's been scheduled by the Labour Party. And there's nothing wrong with that. But make sure that all those issues are looked at in the round. And I think strategically, and in terms of providing holistically the most comprehensive support for the most vulnerable communities, it's the right approach to take.
You've got this very important G7 coming in the early summer in Cornwall. Is your central aim, your central hope, to get the US to rejoin the climate change accord?
Look, we're excited once we get beyond the difficult weeks that we've got ahead, that with the Brexit deal we've got, with this year of global leadership, the presidency of the G7, we're hosting the COP26 climate change talks in November to really lead. That's what leaving the EU and global Britain is all about. One really important aspect is bringing countries together to shift the dial on climate change. We're delighted that President-elect Biden has made clear he wants to rejoin the Paris Agreement. I've had talks with leading Democrats about what we can do. We're excited about that with John Kerry.
Are you going to Washington in the next few weeks to talk about this more?
I anticipate being in the US as soon as practical. Obviously, we just need to wait because the Biden camp have been very clear that until inauguration next Wednesday, they're not engaging formally, at least with foreign governments. We want to respect all of that. But we're excited about the opportunities in this area and many others.
Let's talk about the aftermath of Brexit. Fishing organisations up and down the country are molten with anger about the agreement that you have made, and they feel you have comprehensively betrayed them.
Well, no, I don't accept that. I think this is a great deal for the fishing industry, both short-term and long-term.
Really?
We get control over our fisheries back, full control as an independent coastal state. There's an immediate 15% uplift in our access to fisheries for the UK sector in the first year. That rises to 2/3 in the 5-year transition period. Then we have annual negotiations. And of course, the fishing industry is going to want to increase its capacity to take advantage of those increased stocks. And that's why we're putting in £100 million to shore up, to strengthen the fishing industry right across the whole of the UK, to make sure that this really important opportunity of leaving the EU and leaving the transition period can be properly grasped.
Meanwhile, lots of fishermen are furious that EU boats are inside the 6 to 12 mile fishing area. And in the words of one Sunday newspaper this morning, the Scottish fishing industry in particular is drowning under red tape. Let me just read you two examples. Jamie McMillan of Lochfine Langoustines. We have no sales to the EU, our biggest market for live shellfish in the last 2 weeks. If we go another week without that, we are finished. And Donna Fordyce, who's Chief Executive of Seafood Scotland, says some businesses, which may have been run by families for generations, are now days away from collapse as a result of the agreement you have struck.
Well, I'm not convinced that that's a result of the agreement. The agreement will... sorry, Andrew, can I answer the question? The agreement we have struck, both short-term and medium-term and long-term, will create huge sustainable opportunities. Of course, we've always said as we leave the transition period, and with a deal, but even more if we hadn't have had a deal, there will be some teething problems. We're very focused on working with all of the different sectors, including the fishing industry, to resolve any of these teething problems. And as I said, there's £100 million worth of investment going into the UK fishing sector so that these really important opportunities can be grasped.
Let's turn to another issue. You're an international lawyer. The Board of Deputies of British Jews is comparing what's been happening to the Uyghurs in China to the Holocaust. And there is a vote in the House of Commons tomorrow about whether or not British courts should have the right to declare foreign countries guilty of genocide and therefore refuse trade deals. Now, presumably, as an international lawyer, you will be in favour of that change. You want Britain to be acting by herself on these big issues, working with the United States and other countries, but with her own voice. Is it not the case that it's important that Britain has the right to declare other countries guilty of genocide?
Look, I tell you, as a son of a refugee from the Holocaust, I couldn't be more moved and support the spirit of what is being proposed. That's why we took measures this week on Xinjiang and to prevent the UK businesses supporting or benefiting from or feeding into the supply chains in Xinjiang, and the awful reports we've got of forced labour, slave labour effectively, forced sterilisation, appalling human rights abuses. Whether or not it amounts to genocide has to be determined by a court. And of course, the bar is being set incredibly high. I mean, frankly, we shouldn't be engaged in free trade negotiations with countries abusing human rights well below the level of genocide. I think there is an issue, a challenge, a practical, workable question is whether the High Court in this country, as opposed to a criminal court, has the investigative capacity to actually determine the facts on the ground. But actually, in terms of, and I think there's a second issue, which is really in relation to what we now know about what's going on in Xinjiang. The question is whether in relation to any country that engages in those human rights abuse, you engage in free trade negotiations. That's what the Alton Amendment is all about. And that is really about Parliament holding the government to account. And that's the relationship, rather than have the courts do it. Courts can determine genocide. I think a British court, certainly the High Court in this country, wouldn't have the investigative capacity to do that. But that shouldn't, we shouldn't really be delegating the political question of who you engage in free trade negotiations to the courts. That's something that MPs should hold the government to account about, and we absolutely embrace that.
A big debate for tomorrow. Dominic Rabb, thanks very much indeed for joining us today. Now then, in the third of our New Year leader interviews, I'm joined by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey. Sir Ed, welcome.
Thank you.
A week ago in that seat, Sir Keir Starmer said that Labour was not a rejoined party. Is that the same for the Liberal Democrats?
Yes, we're not a rejoined party, but we are a very pro-European party. We believe it's in the interest of British people, for jobs, small businesses exporting, Scottish fishermen, for our security, for our police services, that we have the closest possible relationship with our European partners, and we'll be arguing throughout the next few months and years that Britain needs to have a far more pro-European position.
Sir Keir also said that he wasn't in favour of reopening the issue of free movement with the EU. Are you?
Yes, I think we should do. Free movement is a huge freedom for British people. British people work across the European Union. They travel, they live, they bring up families across the European Union. It's a huge freedom for our young people. And I think one of the sadnesses of taking away free movement is it's very illiberal. It's taking away that freedom from all our British people.
So this is part of the agreement that's spent years in the making. if you had influence in a future government, you would try and unpick some of that agreement to allow free movement back?
Well, first of all, the agreement still has to have a lot of negotiations. It's not complete. I think people don't recognise that.
There's going to be... That bit's complete, isn't it?
Well, there's weeks and months and years of more negotiation on the EU trade deal.
On things like movement.
Well, not on free movement. That's true. So I'm saying that I want to influence now the negotiations so we have a much closer relationship with our European partners, because that's just so important for British jobs and British security. But in due course, I do think we need to negotiate a much better deal. It's why the Liberal Democrats voted against the EU trade deal, because it was so bad for our country.
Last time we were talking, you said that you were sympathetic to the idea of students getting some of their money back because their education had been so disrupted. There is now a great argument going on about who should pay for that kind of thing. Should it be the government or should it be the universities? What's your answer?
I think it should be the government. I think the government has really let down universities, has let down schools, frankly. I mean, the fiasco from Gavin Williamson, the way he's mismanaged this whole crisis for our children and young people and students, that's why I've called for him to resign. I think he's the worst education secretary we've had in living memory.
But the government can't pay for everything. I mean, debt is at a huge level at the moment. If they're going to pay all the student fees and all the loans off and so forth, that's another massive debt on government. You can't just constantly call on the government to pay for everything.
No, of course not. But the government, during a pandemic, has rightly stepped in. We've supported this, the evidence and the action they've taken to support industry, support vulnerable people. And I don't think you should exclude students from that special support. Indeed, I actually would argue that the government haven't done enough for our schools. I think they should be funding them better. I also think they've not done enough for our economy, particularly for small business and all the 3 million people who've been excluded from support.
There were two great issues that seem to influence Liberal Democrat voters historically. One was Europe, we've talked about. The other one is the environment. There is going to have to be a huge process of national rebuilding after the pandemic. How do you see that affecting our environmental credentials? What should be done?
Well, I've called for a 150 billion green economic recovery plan over 3 years. That's the sort of size we need, both to deal with our economic problems, creating those jobs, those opportunities in the new green industries of the future. But it's also important to tackle climate change. This is an emergency. And I'm afraid the government's response has been weak and timid. They've talked about a £4 billion plan. We need a £150 billion plan.
So we're in the middle, in the eye of the storm of this terribly dangerous pandemic. Do you think parties should be leafleting door to door during this?
Yes, as long as it's compliant. If it's compliant with the guidance, absolutely. The guidance is clear.
I'm not sure it is compliant with the guidance. The guidance is stay at home unless it's really necessary. Wandering from door to door to door, giving people Lib Dem leaflets is not hardly a national priority. With respect.
Well, with respect, the guidance says there's an exemption for volunteer organisations. We've taken legal advice of that, and the advice we've given to all our councillors and volunteers is they need to wear a mask, they need to socially distance, they need to sanitise their hands. We're taking all the sorts of precautions that Amazon takes, that Royal Mail takes. And I'll tell you why it's so important that we do reach out to communities. Liberal Democrat councillors and community activists have always been a key part of helping people. At the beginning of the pandemic, I set up the Liberal Democrat Community COVID Task Force to encourage people to phone people who were isolated, to encourage them to volunteer in food banks.
Going door to door is something very different. Both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have said this is not appropriate at the moment. The Lib Dems carry on doing it. Couldn't you tell people to stop?
It's interesting you say that about the Conservative and Labour Party. They are delivering leaflets too. We've got leaflets from Conservative activists, leaflets from Labour activists that have been delivered in very recent days. So I'm afraid the Conservative and Labour Party need to get their own house in order. And I believe that as long as you're helping community, you're giving people advice, telling them where they can get tested, where they can find the latest government advice, that is the sort of thing that actually, if you're trying to help local people, you should be doing.
All right, Sir Ed Davey of the Liberal Democrats, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking to us. The United States is on alert for possible violent protests this weekend, ahead of President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration on Wednesday. National Guard troops from across the country are being sent to Washington, D.C. to prevent any repeat of the deadly riot when Donald Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building, where both houses of Congress meet. I've been speaking to Julia Borgia, chief political analyst for CNN, and I asked her how different Wednesday was going to feel.
Washington, D.C. is an armed camp right now. We currently have about 20,000 troops in D.C., more than we have in Afghanistan or Iraq. I might I might add, and you layer that on top of the fact that we were already going to have a small inauguration because of COVID. And so what you have is an inauguration that's going to look very different. Normally it's a big celebration, people lining the streets, lots of excitement. The president, the new president in the reviewing stands as there's a parade. So it's going to be very different in look and incredibly different emotionally as people in Washington see their city really taken over by the National Guard.
And of course, the great symbolic moment is one president handing over gracefully to another, a moment of symbolism President Trump has stripped away from America. So how important is that?
I think it's hugely important. I think in a way, President Trump could have stopped everything by saying that Joe Biden is the duly elected next president of the United States. He has not admitted that the big lie he has been telling has absolutely been proven wrong and has been rejected by 60 courts. And he has refused to do that. So there is not going to be any gracious transfer of power as there was when he became president of the United States and Barack Obama welcomed him into the White House, met with him, and Mrs. Obama met with Melania Trump. None of that has occurred. Graciousness is something we have never seen with Donald Trump, and we do not expect to see it on January 20th when he's going to take a plane that morning to Mar-a-Lago and wants to have some kind of event. We have no idea what it will be, but you can be sure that he will not graciously welcome Joe Biden into the White House.
Donald Trump now faces a trial in the Senate following the impeachment vote in the House. What's going to happen there, do you think?
The big thing we're all waiting for is to find out what the leader of the Senate Republicans wants to do, Mitch McConnell. During the first impeachment, he came out right away and said that President Trump should not be impeached. This time he has done no such thing. He has let it be known privately that he thinks Donald Trump has committed an impeachable offense, but that's very different from saying on the floor of the Senate that he wants to impeach him after he's already left office. So it's hard to predict. I'd say the odds are against it.
But presumably to stop a split in the Republican Party, quite a few Republicans would actually find it very convenient if Donald Trump was impeached and prevented from standing again.
Well, first of all, you vote to convict him, and then you have to take another vote to say you can never run for office again. You would likely feel that if he were convicted, that he wouldn't be able to run, that they would then vote you couldn't run for office again. But the truth is that he has already split the Republican Party, that the Republican Party is in tatters right now, trying to figure out what to do in a post-Trump world. How potent will he remain as an out-of-office politician? Will he really run for president in 2024? Who would support him after this? His popularity right now in this country is at an all-time low. It is at 29%. 29%. 58% of the American public say they do not want him to seek office again. But he did get 74 million votes. How many of those voters are disgusted by what has occurred in the last weeks in this country? We really don't yet know. So is he potent? Yes. But I would have to say he's a lot less influential than he was a couple of weeks ago.
You've been covering this extraordinary story for 4 years, but for British viewers, one of the extraordinary aspects of it is the bitter, bitter division in the American media between the two sides. Is it fair to say the American media is broken?
Well, I do think you have a point there.
facilities got about 50% more critical care beds available now than in the core services. Secondly, hospitals are working together with their immediate neighbours to share the load. And then in a very small number of cases, the whole of the NHS is clubbing together and there are transfers of patients between regions. But just to put that in context, I think we've got over 5,000 patients in critical care right now, and I think the number of transfers between regions yesterday was 9 people.
That may be a small number of people, but sorry, Lucy Watson of the
stem the growth in infections actually succeeds. The likelihood is that even with a stabilising perhaps of infections in some parts of the country, we're still seeing increases in infections amongst the over 60s in many parts of the country, and the forecasts are that the pressures will only get more intense in hospitals over the next several weeks.
So what happens to those hospitals in Birmingham or Manchester or across the northwest to which patients may be being transferred now when they fill up? Because, of course, they had a really, really hard time during the first wave.
That's right. So, as I say, the first response is to make use of the additional surge critical care capacity that is in place across England. That has meant that we have got around 5,600 critical care beds available now, compared with 3,700 as the core. And staff are working incredibly flexibly, flexing the staff to patient ratios, all of which is the right response, but is highly undesirable. And it is grounded in the fact that coronavirus, particularly this new variant, has been out of control.
You mentioned staff to patient ratios. When it comes to nurses in intensive care units, ICU units, the advice is that it should be 1 to 1. But during a pandemic, it could be 1 to 2. What's the current ratio of nurses in ICUs to patients in London at the moment?
It varies between hospitals, but it can be between 1 to 1 to 1 to 2 to 1 to 3. People are making these dynamic adjustments in real time. So when you've had film crews in the intensive care units at University College Hospitals in London, or the Royal Free, or down at the Royal London, I mean, I think you've seen very directly, firsthand, from those nurses what this means.
And there's even been reports of 1 to 4. None of it sounds very safe. Are these patients getting the care they need?
Patients are being looked after with the fantastic staff across not just critical care but hospitals as well, because one of the things that has changed over the course of the pandemic is that the treatments on offer have continued to evolve and improve. And so a lot more patients are now being looked after with oxygen therapy on general acute wards rather than requiring intensive care per se. And over and above that, as you know, the NHS was the first health service in the world to identify an effective treatment that cut death rates for severely ill coronavirus patients. That was dexamethasone, and then within the last few weeks we've seen a further breakthrough with the repurposing of drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, which can cut your relative risk by a quarter as well. So staff are going flat out. They are providing the highest quality care possible, but the key point has got to be, unless the coronavirus infection rate is under control, then here, just as in every other country in the world, we've seen this in France, we've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in Belgium, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we're seeing it in Los Angeles, in the United States. These services will remain under severe pressure.
Straight question, has the NHS ever been in a more precarious situation?
No, I think this is a unique event in our 72-year history. It's sort of become glib to talk about this as the worst pandemic in a century, but that is clearly correct. We have got 3/4 more COVID inpatients now than we had in the April peak, and although we are, as I say, seeing some promising signs of the steadying of the infection rates, The fact is that they are still far too high, and in some parts of the country and amongst some age groups they are still rising.
Let's turn to the other huge side of your work, which is producing the vaccine programme. Would you like to see vaccines being delivered into people all day, all night, so-called 24/7?
Well, Andrew, of course, nobody in the health service needs persuading of the urgency and importance of getting vaccines delivered at just the same rate as they're made available to us by the manufacturers. It's our staff who are living with the consequences of coronavirus day in and day out. And of course, the health service itself is a 24/7 health service. This hospital, hundreds of thousands across the health service, I should say, hundreds of thousands of staff will have worked the night shift last night, whether that's nurses, junior doctors, radiographers, paramedics. So absolutely we will do that at the point that we've got enough supply that it makes sense. But I think it's worth noting that
I'm sorry to jump in, but to be absolutely clear, when you get the supply of the vaccine, you can and will go 24/7 across the NHS to provide the vaccines?
We will start testing 24/7 in some hospitals over the course of the next 10 days, but we are at the moment vaccinating at the rate of about 140 jabs a minute, and yesterday, Saturday, 250,000 people got their vaccines on the NHS, and I'm pretty confident that by the time we get to the end of today, Sunday night, we will have perhaps done 1.5 million vaccinations this past week. That's up from around 1 million the week before and a third 1 million the week before that. So this is a huge team effort. This is bringing together the NHS, the St John's Ambulance, volunteers, the Royal Voluntary Society. We are vaccinating not just in health centres and hospitals, but in village halls and rugby clubs and cathedrals and shopping centres and racecourses. So everybody is coming together to get this done, and I think we're off to a very strong start.
That's a very good story. Is anybody in the NHS being told to give excess vaccine?
Facts. Those are the facts.
No, I'm not saying it's not. I'm not the fact. Is anybody in the NHS being asked to throw away excess vaccines?
Definitely not. The message, the guidance from the Chief Medical Officer and from the NHS Medical Director is crystal clear that every last drop of vaccine should be used. In fact, our GPs and our vaccinators are doing a fantastic job, and in many cases the vials of the vaccine they're getting, they're able to get 6 doses out of the originally described 5-dose vial. And what has been said is that if at the end of your vaccination session you've got a few left, then please have a reserve list of staff and high-risk patients per the 4 groups who are currently supposed to be getting the vaccine, so that they can be vaccinated at short notice. And that's what the vast majority of services are doing, and if anybody hasn't got that in hand, then that's what now needs to happen.
If we manage to vaccinate the 4 most vulnerable groups by the 15th of February, and everything you're saying suggests that we may well be able to do that, does that mean that restrictions can start to be lifted 3 weeks later in March?
Well, it's worth remembering that in addition to the 12 million people in England over the age of 70 and the clinically extremely vulnerable and the staff who are looking after them that are being offered vaccination in this first group, then there's another 14 million people to follow, aged 50 and above, and then another 18 million people across the population aged 18 and above. Those are for England, and equivalent numbers for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So this is going to be a vaccination campaign that is going to take weeks and some months. And of course, the great benefit of starting with the most vulnerable is that, as you say, enables us to reduce the risk of death from coronavirus. But it's worth remembering, Andrew, that a quarter of patients being hospitalised for COVID right now are aged under 55. So I don't think this is with one bound we are free. This is going to be a progressive improvement as we get more coronavirus vaccination supply. And vaccination supply is the crucial thing.
Sure.
We need that to come on week by week, month by month, in the way that the manufacturers think they can get it to us.
So the reason I'm asking this is that the Foreign Secretary just told us that we're not going to get every adult in the UK vaccinated until the autumn, until some period in the autumn. And some people listening to that will think, OK, if that is the target that the NHS has, if that's the moment the NHS thinks things are safe to lift, we may not see restrictions lifted until much, much later this year.
No, look, if we want to go as fast as we possibly can, I suspect that we will be able to have more vaccine supply such that we may be able to do faster than that. But there will be a balance of risk, a judgment that government and policymakers will have to make. I think the truth lies somewhere between the two. It's not going to be the case that on Valentine's Day or the 15th of February, with one bound we are free. But equally, I don't think that we will be having to wait until the autumn. I think somewhere between those two, subject, of course, to this uncertainty about new variants of the coronavirus. And it will be very important that we don't see those taking off in a way that undermines the effectiveness of vaccines that we currently have.
You've quite rightly talked a lot about your own staff. There are lots of people on the front line in hospitals who are rather concerned that they're not getting both doses of the Pfizer vaccine and therefore full protection, even though they are very, very much at risk. Do you think that NHS staff who are actually on the front line in hospital wards should be getting both doses of the Pfizer vaccine?
Well, of course, I strongly think that we need to protect NHS staff and indeed social care staff working more widely with vulnerable older people. It's the right thing to do for those individuals, and it's the right thing to do for the services that they're providing. Right now, Andrew, we've got 53,000 NHS staff who are off work for coronavirus-related reasons. So this will enable us to sustain those services. Everybody will get those second doses, and that is going to mean that a lot of the vaccination that is happening in February and particularly March will be second doses, not just for staff, but of course for the older people who've had their vaccination over the last 4 to 6 weeks. And I think it's also worth saying that, pleasingly, we have now vaccinated more than half of the people aged over 80 and above. So that, sure, I think, sets us on a very good path for the next several weeks.
Given the pressure on the NHS, given all those people off sick, are you bringing in army people to help? Trained army people come into hospitals in London and elsewhere?
Yes, there are around 200 combat medical technicians who are going to be supporting. As I say, we've got over 50,000 NHS staff who are currently off for coronavirus-related reasons. So those 200 people will definitely help. And in addition to that, we've also got 50,000 more staff now working in the health service than we had a year ago. So, look, one of the things that comes out of this whole pandemic, I think, is that we have got to take the staffing resilience of the health service very, very seriously in the years to come.
Last question, Sir Simon. Would you like to stay on as Chief Executive of the NHS in England right the way through this pandemic? Well,
we all want to see the end of this. We all want to see the end of this pandemic, quite frankly, Andrew. The complete focus of everybody working in the health service, including me right now, is this double goal of continuing to tackle infection while also getting the COVID vaccination injections out. And the good news is that at the moment we are vaccinating 4 times faster than people are newly catching coronavirus. But that ratio will only be able to hold the line if people continue to do the right thing and prevent the transmission of coronavirus. If we can do that, then we can see a way to a much better future over the course of the rest of this year.
A very good thought to end on. Sir Simon, thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks to all my guests and, of course, to you for watching. Until next week, goodbye.